There are moments in a woman's life that do not feel like decisions she has made, but like invitations she has stumbled into. A video appears in her feed at the exact instant she feels something inside her fraying. A phrase overheard in a cafe cuts through the noise and lands in the center of her chest. A book falls open to a passage that describes a pain she has never been able to name. It feels less like she has found these things and more like they have found her. As if some quiet, observing intelligence has been tracking her inner life and now at this precise threshold has decided it is time. In Jungian terms, this is not mere coincidence, but an instance of synchronicity. Synchronicity describes a meaningful coincidence between an inner state and an outer event. Two lines of reality aligning without causal connection, yet carrying an unmistakable sense of significance. The unconscious, which Jung saw not as a wastebasket of repressed material, but as a living, purposeful field of meaning, uses these coincidences to signal that something in the psyche has shifted. When a woman finds herself listening to words that name her secret confusion, it is not the video that is magical. It is her readiness. The psyche has reached a point where the old equilibrium can no longer hold, and the outer world begins to echo that inner instability. Before this moment, life may have looked relatively coherent from the outside. Roles were played with competence: partner, mother, colleague, friend, good daughter, reliable professional. This surface stability is maintained by what Jung called the persona, the social mask we construct to adapt to the demands of our environment. The persona is not inherently false. It is a necessary interface, a way of being someone in the world. But over time, especially for women conditioned to be pleasing, accommodating, and self-erasing, the persona thickens. It stops being a flexible mask and hardens into a shell. The woman functions, even excels, yet somewhere beneath the polished presentation, something essential begins to suffocate. The first crack in the persona rarely announces itself with drama. More often it arrives as a subtle dissonance. She notices a tightness in her chest before a meeting where she must once again play the competent, untroubled one. She feels a wave of inexplicable exhaustion at the idea of another social gathering where she will laugh at jokes that bore her and nod at stories that do not move her. Sleep becomes less restorative even when she rests. Her body, often wiser than her conscious mind, begins to register the cost of maintaining a self that is no longer aligned with her inner truth. Somatic symptoms, fatigue, heaviness, hormonal unevenness, vague aches that elude medical explanation become the language through which the unconscious speaks. From a Jungian perspective, these symptoms are not random malfunctions. They are compensatory signals, attempts by the psyche to correct an imbalance between the outer adaptation and the inner life. When the persona dominates, when a woman lives primarily from the image of who she is supposed to be, the deeper center of the psyche, the self, begins to withdraw its energy. The self in Jung's thought is the organizing totality of the personality, conscious and unconscious alike. It is not the ego, not the I, that manages appointments and obligations, but the underlying pattern that knows what this particular life is meant to become. When the ego's way of living diverges too far from that pattern, tension builds. The woman does not necessarily know what is wrong. She only knows that continuing as before feels increasingly impossible. At this point, synchronicities tend to cluster. A client says something in passing that describes her private despair. She keeps encountering the same symbol: a threshold, a door, a desert in dreams, films, or artwork. A phrase like, "I can't do this anymore," escapes her lips before she has fully understood what this even is. These are not signs in the simplistic fortune-telling sense, but reflections of an emergent inner reality. The unconscious is pressing upward, seeking a new configuration, and reality begins to mirror that pressure. The outer world becomes strangely responsive, as if the fabric between inner and outer has thinned. What she experiences subjectively may feel like confusion, restlessness, or a hollowing out of meaning. Activities that once felt satisfying now seem strangely flat. Conversations that used to animate her feel scripted. The rewards she has worked for, approval, stability, relational harmony, professional success, no longer provide the anchoring warmth they once did. She begins to withdraw, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. Friends call and she hesitates before answering. Noise that she once tolerated now grates on her nerves. She risks being labeled distant, moody, ungrateful, or not herself. Yet, in a deeper sense, this is the first time she has come close to herself in years. This withdrawal marks the beginning of a liminal phase, a psychological threshold space. From the outside, it may resemble depression. From the inside, it feels like standing between two worlds. The old identity has not yet fully dissolved, but its authority is weakened. The new orientation has not yet taken shape, but its gravitational pull is unmistakable. Jung understood such thresholds as portals through which the ego is invited, sometimes dragged toward a more authentic alignment with the self. The woman does not yet know that what feels like a breakdown is, from the psyche's perspective, the necessary prelude to a more profound kind of life. There comes a moment, often quiet and unremarkable from the outside, when the familiar scaffolding of a woman's life begins to loosen. A subtle disidentification occurs. She finds herself watching her own behaviors with a strange sense of distance, as though the person speaking, smiling, reassuring others is someone she once knew but no longer is. This internal split is the psyche's way of preparing her for descent. Jung wrote that no transformation is possible without first withdrawing energy from the old structures of identity. The psyche must deanimate what no longer serves before it can reanimate something new. As the persona fractures, the woman is drawn inward with increasing force. She may feel a sudden aversion to environments that once energized her, sensing beneath the surface the unspoken expectations, the subtle manipulations, the countless small negotiations of selfhood required to maintain harmony. It becomes harder to pretend, harder to ignore the quiet ache beneath the roles, harder to preserve a version of herself that no longer feels habitable. What she experiences as emotional fatigue is psychologically the ego's loss of libido, its loss of the life energy that once fueled its commitments. That energy is now being pulled downward into the depths of the unconscious. This is the beginning of the descent, a movement Jung compared to mythic journeys into the underworld. It is not a poetic metaphor, but a phenomenological description of what happens when the unconscious rises to meet the surface. The woman may feel as though she is sinking into herself, losing her bearings, entering a territory without maps. Old certainties dissolve. New instincts emerge with unsettling clarity. Dreams become vivid, sometimes disturbing, laden with symbols, shadows, ancient figures, serpents, thresholds, forgotten rooms. These images are not random. They are messages from the deeper layers of the psyche, fragments of an internal drama that has been unfolding in silence for years. One of the first figures to emerge from this depth is the shadow. In Jungian psychology, the shadow represents all the qualities the ego has deemed unacceptable. Anger, ambition, sexual desire unlinked from pleasing others, pride, self-protection, the ability to say no. For many women, the shadow contains precisely the traits that would make them powerful, because these traits were forbidden by early relational environments. She may feel flashes of anger she cannot explain, surges of desire she has long suppressed, or a fierce clarity about boundaries that shocks even her. These eruptions are not regressions. They are revelations, glimpses of a fuller selfhood pushing toward recognition. The confrontation with the shadow is not gentle. It destabilizes the ego. It forces the woman to question her moral self-image, her relational patterns, her choices. Yet this confrontation is essential. Without reclaiming what has been exiled, no genuine wholeness is possible. Jung insisted that individuation, the process of aligning the ego with the self, requires integrating the shadow, not transcending it. The woman begins to understand that the emotions she feared were signs of failure are actually signs of life. Rage is not pathology, but a boundary violated. Desire is not corruption, but vitality. Ambition is not selfishness, but potential-seeking expression. As she goes deeper, she encounters not only her personal shadow, but the larger patterns embedded in her lineage. Jung described the collective unconscious as a reservoir of inherited psychic material, but he also acknowledged a more specific inheritance, the transgenerational transmission of relational wounds. The woman may begin to sense echoes of her mother's silences in her own. She may feel the weight of her grandmother's resignation, her great-grandmother's unspoken grief. These are not ghosts in the supernatural sense. They are psychological imprints, patterns of adaptation passed down through generations of women who learn to survive by shrinking themselves. During this phase, she might feel a presence behind her ancestral feminine, ancient, an intuition that she is not merely confronting her own knots of pain, but unwinding a larger tapestry. Her suffering acquires meaning. Her exhaustion becomes lineage deep. Her desire for truth feels not solely personal, but evolutionary, as though something in the feminine psyche as a whole is attempting to rise through her. This insight does not arrive as an abstract theory, but as a bodily knowing, a heaviness in the chest that is not only hers, a grief that feels older than her lifetime, a strength that surprises her in its sudden, undeniable emergence. Here, the father complex often surfaces a deep internalized relationship to masculine authority. For many women, this complex manifests as an unconscious need for male approval, a shaping of identity around being acceptable, desirable, or validating to the masculine gaze. When this complex dissolves, it can feel like losing a center of gravity. The woman may realize she has lived her entire life performing for an invisible audience of masculine judgment, trying to be good, agreeable, accomplished, or lovable according to standards not her own. As this complex breaks apart, the approval she once sought loses its emotional charge. What once carried the weight of life or death significance now feels strangely irrelevant. This loss is liberating, but it is also terrifying. If she is no longer performing for external validation, who is she? What inner compass replaces the borrowed one? In the silence left behind, a new orientation begins to take shape. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It arises from a deeper layer of knowing, a kind of inner sovereignty that does not ask for permission. And with this sovereignty, the libido shifts again. The energy that once flowed outward in the pursuit of approval, harmony, or productivity begins to circulate inward. What Jung called eros, the connective, life-affirming principle, awakens not in relation to others, but within the woman herself. She feels desire not as something to be given or withheld, but as a creative force, a generative fire that belongs to her alone. Something in her is beginning to be born. There comes a peculiar quiet after the descent, a hush so complete it feels as though the world has stepped back and left the woman alone with something ancient. This is not loneliness in the social sense, but an interior solitude, the kind that surrounds any being in the midst of metamorphosis. She may still move through her daily routines, but underneath them, she feels suspended as though hovering between two layers of reality. The old architecture of her psyche has cracked and the new structure has not yet formed. Jung compared this stage to the nigredo in alchemy, the blackening, the dissolution, the moment when form disintegrates so that new substance can emerge. In this liminal chamber, she begins to sense that her life is no longer proceeding horizontally through goals, tasks, relationships, but vertically descending into layers of psyche she had long ignored. Dreams become central. They may present images of crossing water, wandering through endless corridors, confronting figures who seem to know her better than she knows herself. Jung saw these dream figures as autonomous expressions of the unconscious, fragments of the self trying to communicate. She might wake unsettled, but with a strange sense of recognition. Something inside her is speaking in a language older than words. Her body also becomes a site of revelation. She feels a strange heaviness in the belly, or an ache in the heart that feels less like sadness and more like pressure, as if something is trying to emerge from the inside out. Jung taught that the psyche is not separate from the body. The unconscious communicates somatically, especially in women whose instincts have often been culturally muted. What she once dismissed as just stress now feels like coded intelligence. The fatigue is no longer merely exhaustion, it is resistance to the life she has outgrown. The tightness in her chest is not anxiety, it is the contraction that precedes expansion. Her body becomes an oracle translating truths her mind has refused to speak. In this interior hush, certain memories long buried begin to rise, not always traumatic but charged moments where she swallowed her words, dimmed her brilliance, hid her anger, or pretended she was satisfied. These memories surface not to torment her, but to be integrated. Jung insisted that nothing from the psyche is useless. Everything that rises does so because it seeks redemption and meaning. As she allows these fragments to surface, the shadow softens. It becomes less threatening. What once felt monstrous begins to feel human. The qualities she feared in herself, ambition, intensity, sensuality, rage, reveal themselves as energies she must reclaim if she is to live authentically. During this phase, the woman may feel surrounded by presences she cannot name. Not hallucinations, but psychic companions, inner figures whose voices once ignored now speak clearly. Jung called these figures archetypes, universal psychic patterns that express themselves through symbols, intuitions, and emotions. For her, the feminine archetypes may intensify the warrior who refuses to be silenced, the mother who nurtures truth rather than conformity, the sage who values depth over approval, the queen who carries sovereignty in her bones. These archetypes do not dictate behavior, but offer blueprints for new ways of being. At times, she may feel the presence of her female ancestors, a lineage of women whose struggles, silences, and strengths pulse through her blood. Jung understood that psychic material is inherited not only biologically, but symbolically. Patterns of submission, caretaking, endurance, or suppression travel through generations until someone becomes conscious enough to break them. The woman might feel as though she is grieving for more than herself. Her tears may carry the weight of women who never had the chance to feel their own. This is transgenerational individuation, the psyche's attempt to heal not just one life but a lineage. As she descends further, she encounters the animus, the inner masculine figure within the female psyche. In its immature form, the animus can appear as a harsh inner critic, a voice of judgment, rigidity, or perfectionism. But as it matures, it becomes a source of clarity, discernment, and inner authority. She begins to rely less on external structures and more on her own internal compass. She starts hearing the subtle difference between intuition and fear, between genuine instinct and learned compliance. At first, the emergence of this inner masculine clarity can feel disruptive. She may find herself saying no where she once said yes, automatically pulling back from relationships built on imbalance, or refusing to justify decisions that once required lengthy explanations. But beneath this disruption lies a profound synthesis, the union of eros and logos, the reconciliation of feminine feeling with masculine discernment. This inner marriage, what Jung called the coniunctio, marks a turning point in her transformation. It signals that she is no longer fragmenting herself to survive. Piece by piece, the psyche is reorganizing itself around a deeper center, and then almost imperceptibly the descent begins to shift. Something stirs upward. A faint current of renewal moves through her, a subtle excitement, an unnameable longing, a spark that feels like the first breath after years of holding it. The libido, which had been withdrawn from the outer world, begins to rise again, but this time it carries a different texture. It is not aimed at pleasing, performing, or achieving. It is rooted in authenticity and eros, as life force, creative, embodied, unashamed. She senses it in small things, the way her breath deepens when she speaks her truth, the way her skin tingles when she imagines a life aligned with her real values, the way her heart softens when she stops trying to be someone else's version of good. This is the beginning of her ascent, though she may not yet recognize it. Something almost imperceptible begins to take root within her, a quiet coherence, the first subtle alignment between her ego and the deeper organizing principle Jung called the self. This alignment is not dramatic. It arrives gently, like the soft hum beneath a piece of music barely heard yet unmistakably present. For the first time in a long while, she feels slightly more solid inside herself, as though some internal axis has rotated by a few degrees and now points toward a truer direction. She cannot articulate it yet, but she knows something essential is beginning to gather strength. With this shift, her outer life often begins to rearrange itself. Not because she forces change, but because the energy that once sustained misaligned roles begins to withdraw. Relationships built on her compliance feel increasingly strained. Obligations she accepted out of habit weigh more heavily. Work that once seemed tolerable now feels like an invisible cage. She may feel confused by this unraveling, but Jung would say that the psyche is correcting itself. When the ego stops clinging to personas and inherited scripts, Life naturally moves toward authenticity, even if the path initially looks like disruption. During this period, synchronicities often intensify. She encounters people who mirror her emerging strength, conversations that articulate truths she has just begun to feel, symbols that recur across dreams and waking moments with uncanny timing. These are not coincidences meant to be decoded like messages from beyond. They are the psyche's way of affirming her movement toward individuation. When inner and outer reality begin to resonate, when the unconscious and the conscious mind operate in greater harmony, the world itself seems to respond. Jung believed that psyche and matter were two expressions of the same underlying reality, different faces of a single unified field. Thus, when a woman shifts inwardly, the texture of her life shifts outwardly as well. Her energy changes too. Not in the performative sense that culture often demands, radiance as spectacle, confidence as display, but in a deeper, more grounded way. The libido that once leaked out through people-pleasing, self-erasure, or anxiety now circulates within her, strengthening her presence. Her boundaries sharpen not out of defensiveness, but out of clarity. She finds herself unable to tolerate falsehood, whether in others or in herself. Conversations reliant on pretense or superficial intimacy leave her drained. Authenticity becomes her new oxygen. Anything less feels suffocating. This heightened discernment is not a flaw. It is the emergence of the intuitive function. Jung described the ability to perceive underlying realities without rational analysis. She senses intention in another person's silence, feels the hidden emotional currents beneath a conversation, detects the unspoken agreements that once ensnared her. This perceptiveness can be overwhelming at first. She may worry she is becoming too sensitive, too intense. But what is actually happening is integration, the awakening of capacities that were always hers but had been muted by adaptation. Her relationships begin to reflect this change. Some connections deepen as she brings more truth into them. Others falter under the weight of her new presence. Those who benefited from her smallness may react with discomfort, confusion, or even resentment. They may accuse her of changing, becoming self-centered, difficult, or withdrawn. In truth, she is shedding an artificial identity they had mistaken for her real self. Their discomfort is not a measure of her misalignment, but of her evolution. In the space created by these dissolving attachments, something radical becomes possible. She begins to experience herself without distortion, without the need for external validation, particularly masculine validation. Her psyche reorganizes around an internal axis of authority. The father complex, which once acted as an unseen gravitational field shaping her choices, starts to loosen its grip. She no longer instinctively looks outward for permission. The gaze of the external masculine, whether literal or internalized, stops determining her worth. And with this release, a profound shift occurs in her erotic life. Not eroticism in the cultural sense of seduction or desirability, but eros as Jung understood it, the connective, life-giving principle of the psyche. Her erotic energy is no longer tied to being chosen. It becomes a force of creation rather than a strategy for belonging. She feels a warmth in her body that is not oriented toward the gaze of another, but toward the vitality of existence itself. This is the return of the creative libido, the deeper generative power that moves through all living things. This energy often expresses itself not through sexuality but through imagination, intuition, creativity, and an increased sense of possibility. She may feel drawn to art, writing, nature, music, movement activities that allow the psyche to express itself without censorship. The woman who once felt numb or exhausted begins to feel a faint thrum of aliveness, a subtle excitement not for any external achievement, but simply for being. It is eros as presence, eros as breath, eros as the quiet pulse of the self moving through her. As this new orientation takes hold, she begins to sense a future self, not in the timeline sense, but as a deeper possibility within her. She feels a woman inside who is more sovereign, more whole, more fearless in her truth. This inner figure is not a fantasy or idealized version of who she wishes to be. She is an archetypal image emerging from the self. Jung believed that the psyche anticipates who we are meant to become long before the ego catches up. The woman senses this inner presence not as pressure, but as invitation. She is beginning to ascend not outwardly, not socially, but psychologically. Yet ascent does not mean ease. At this stage, many women experience a profound, almost existential solitude, not abandonment, but altitude. The air thins as consciousness expands. The familiar anchors of identity roles relationships, social scripts no longer define her. She stands at a height where few have stood, where the view is wide, but companions are few. This solitude is not a sign she has gone astray. It is the natural consequence of individuation. Jung wrote that the individuated self inevitably stands somewhat alone because it no longer seeks refuge in collective identities. She stands alone not because she is unloved, but because she is finally herself. And this, paradoxically, prepares her for the final stage, the return, the integration, the homecoming. There is a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when the long arc of her transformation begins to turn inward toward completion. She feels it not as triumph, but as recognition, a kind of deep exhale from the center of her being. The psyche, having undergone dissolution, confrontation, descent, and reorientation, now begins the work of integration. This is not a return to who she was. It is a return to the self, the psychological home she has been unconsciously orbiting her entire life. At this stage, her solitude takes on a different texture. It no longer feels like exile or disconnection, but like clarity. The empty spaces that once frightened her now feel spacious, expansive, alive with subtle guidance. The world is quieter, but her inner world is fuller. She realizes she no longer needs noise to distract her relationships to validate her, or roles to define her worth. The ego, once frantic, once terrified of dissolution, has softened. It no longer clings to certainty. It has tasted surrender and survived. In this softened state, a remarkable thing occurs. Her perception of reality shifts. She senses connections she once overlooked. A conversation with a stranger reverberates with symbolic meaning. A single line in a book seems to illuminate an entire decade of her life. Intuition sharpens into a mode of knowing that is neither mystical nor irrational, but deeply attuned. Jung wrote that the individuated person begins to perceive the world symbolically. The woman now sees not only events, but the patterns beneath them, not only relationships, but the psychological dynamics animating them, not only choices, but the archetypal forces influencing them. The integration of her shadow becomes more natural. She no longer panics when anger arises. She listens. She no longer shames herself for desire. She follows its deeper intelligence. She no longer suppresses her ambition. She channels it. The qualities she once feared in herself are now part of her wholeness. Her shadow, once a cluster of forbidden impulses, has become a source of vitality and resilience. Her ancestors, the women whose struggles shaped the psychic soil she grew from, also feel closer. Not as ghosts or sentimental notions, but as inner presences whose patterns she now understands. She recognizes where her mother's silences lived in her own throat. She sees how her grandmother's resignation echoed in her relationships. She can feel the ancestral longing for authenticity vibrating through her bloodstream. And she realizes with quiet astonishment that her transformation is not hers alone. She is unbinding knots tied generations before she was born. Jung understood this individuation is never purely personal. It ripples backward and forward through the lineage, altering the psychic field for those who came before and those who will come after. This awareness gives her life a new sense of gravity. Decisions are no longer merely choices, they are contributions. Boundaries are not rejections, they are acts of liberation. Speaking the truth becomes a form of ancestral healing. Choosing authenticity becomes an evolutionary gesture. As she moves through her days with this new awareness, she begins to encounter a deeper force within her, the self in its purest form. It does not speak in language, but in orientation, in a feeling of innate rightness. She recognizes it in the ease she feels when she does not abandon herself. She feels it in the warmth that spreads through her body when she chooses alignment over approval. She senses it in the stillness that settles in her chest when she refuses to betray her intuition. This is the culmination of the journey Jung called individuation, The ego aligning with the deeper organizing core of the psyche. In this alignment, contradictions harmonize. She can be fierce and tender, ambitious and restful, solitary and connected. She no longer fragments herself. She is not halves or roles or adaptations. She is whole. And with this wholeness comes a sovereignty that does not need to be declared. It radiates through her presence. She no longer performs, persuades, or pleads. She no longer attaches her worth to whether she is chosen, appreciated, understood, or admired. Her value is intrinsic, unassailable. It exists prior to every external interaction. This sovereignty does not make her cold. It makes her clear. It allows her to love without losing herself, to give without depletion, to speak without apology. Others feel this shift, not always comfortably. Her authenticity becomes a mirror that reflects back where others are still fragmented, still performing, still bound by their personas. Some are drawn to her clarity. Others are threatened by it. But she no longer adjusts her essence to avoid discomfort. She knows now that truth, not harmony, is the foundation of real connection. In the final movements of her transformation, she realizes a profound paradox. She did not become someone new. She removed what was false. She shed what was inherited. She released what was imposed. And beneath all that fell away, she discovered a self that had been waiting patiently, quietly for her return. The deepest truth of this journey is simple and astonishing. You are not transforming into power. You are remembering that you were power all along. If this exploration resonated with you, if it named something rising inside you or illuminated part of your own descent and rebirth, consider joining this ongoing journey into Jungian depth psychology and feminine consciousness. Like the video to support this work. Share it with a woman who might need these words. Subscribe if you feel called to continue exploring the inner landscapes we uncover here. And leave a comment with where you are in your own process. Your story may become another woman's lifeline 6 months from now.